Okay, let's unpack this. When you think about applying for a job, what's one of the first things that comes to mind? Your resume, right? That list of your skills, your experience. You probably think of it as this, objective record, proof that you're the best candidate based purely on your work history.
It really is the fundamental document, isn't it? We spend so much time crafting it, believing, well, hoping maybe, that it's a neutral presentation of what we can do.
Absolutely. But what if a recent deep dive into actual hiring data showed that this seemingly objective work history isn't quite so neutral? What if it revealed these subtle kind of structural biases linked to race? Biases that can affect your chances before a human even reads your name.
That really pushes back against the common idea about meritocracy in hiring, doesn't it?
It totally does, and that's exactly what we're getting into today. Our source material is some really fascinating, groundbreaking research. It's from professors at UC Irvine and Emory University. Their paper, it's called Applying While Black, The Collateral Effects of Racial Differences in Work Histories, and it was just published in Administrative Science Quarterly, which is a top journal.
Yeah, that title alone tells you they're looking at something complex, something often overlooked.
It certainly does. So our mission here in this deep dive is to really unpack their research. You want to understand how they tackled something as messy as work history and actually turned it into measurable data. Then reveal their, frankly, surprising findings about this link between race, work history, and hiring outcomes. And finally, talk about what this all means for companies hiring and for applicants like you navigating the job market. Seriously, get ready to see job applications in a whole new light.
So this kind of research, it often starts with someone noticing something unexpected, right? Like in the real world data. Where did the spark for this particular study come from?
Yeah, according to the researchers, the initial spark came from one of the co-authors, Prasanna Parasurama. He was actually working in HR analytics at the time.
Yeah.
He had access to this huge, anonymized data set, hiring info from Bay Area tech companies, and he shared it with the academic team.
Ah, so they had this rich, real-world hiring data to start digging into. That's a great starting point.
Exactly. And they started by looking at pretty standard stuff. Did factors in someone's work history affect their hiring success? And yeah, they found patterns. Certain work history characteristics seemed to correlate with outcomes. That wasn't a huge surprise.
Okay, so far so normal.
Right. The surprise came when they noticed a relationship between the applicant's race and those specific work history factors.
Ah, okay. So that must have been the moment they realized, wait a minute, this story is deeper. It wasn't just work history matters, but how race might be tangled up with the kind of work history someone has and how that history gets evaluated.
Precisely. They realized they needed to figure out how race and work history were interacting structurally. But first, they hit this huge challenge. How do you even measure something as varied, as subjective as work history across thousands of different resumes?
Right. It's not like measuring, say, years of experience or GPA. Work history is full of descriptions, job titles, timelines. It's messy data.
Professor Leung, one of the authors, really highlighted this. They had to find a way to operationalize it, basically, turn it into numbers they could analyze. So they decided to focus on two key dimensions they thought were crucial for how employers evaluate past experience: relevance and specialization.
Okay, so relevance. That's about how closely your previous jobs match the job you're applying for now.
Exactly. And specialization. That was about whether your career path seemed really focused in one area or if it was broader, maybe spanning different fields.
Got it. But how do you objectively measure the distance between a job description for a senior software engineer and someone's past role as, I don't know, a database administrator, or quantify how specialized a career is?
This is where they got really innovative, methodologically speaking.
They used a pretty sophisticated natural language processing technique. It's called a word-to-vec model.
Word-to-vec. Okay, break that down for us. What does that actually do?
Well, think of it like creating a map of words based on how they're actually used together in context, in lots and lots of text. So they fed the model tons of text, job descriptions, resumes, and it learns which words are semantically similar. Which words tend to appear in similar contexts? For instance, words like C++ and programming would end up close together on this map.
Okay.
While words used in totally different contexts, maybe like baking and programming, would be really far apart.
Ah, okay. So they weren't just keyword matching job titles. They were looking at the meaning embedded in the language used to describe roles and responsibilities.
Exactly that. They used this model to quantify the semantic similarity, you could call it the closeness, between a candidate's previous job descriptions and the target job description. That gave them their measure of relevance. And they also used it to measure the average distance or the variation between a candidate's own past jobs. That gave them a metric for specialization.
Wow. Okay. That's actually quite clever. Using AI to turn all that qualitative text from resumes into quantitative metrics seems like a powerful tool for this kind of research.
Oh, absolutely. It allows for this large-scale systematic analysis of work history in a way that just wasn't really feasible before. So once they had these metrics for work history figured out, they needed to bring in the race data.
Right. How did they handle that piece? That's obviously sensitive information.
Well, about 70% of the applicants in their data set had actually self-reported their race through the application tracking system. That's generally considered the most reliable method.
Okay, that's a good chunk. What about the other 30%?
For the remaining applicants, they used a predictive algorithm. It was developed by the HR startup whose data they were using. This algorithm estimated race probabilities based on factors like names, schools attended, locations, things like that.
Predictive algorithms for race can be controversial, though. Was there concern about the accuracy there?
The researchers were very upfront about that. They acknowledged that predictive methods aren't perfect. But they did what researchers call rigorous robustness checks. They basically ran their analyses multiple ways. They ran it using only the self-reported data, for example. And they found their core findings held up consistently, regardless of which data they used.
That's reassuring.
And another really important advantage of this particular data set was its size. It actually included enough data points for Black applicants to perform a meaningful statistical analysis. That's often a major limitation in studies using tech hiring data, where some groups are underrepresented.
Okay, so they had the data, they have their clever metrics for work history relevance and specialization, and they had the race information checked for robustness. So what did the numbers actually reveal when they put it all together? What was the central finding of the study?
The most significant finding, the core discovery, was this. Looking across the entire data set, Black applicants, on average, had work histories that the model identified as statistically less specialized and less directly relevant to the specific jobs they were applying for, compared to other racial groups in the data.
Okay, wait. So on average, the data showed their career paths, according to these metrics, were seen as a bit broader or maybe less perfectly aligned with the very specific requirements of the tech roles they were applying to in this data set.
That's what the quantitative analysis showed, yes. And this is the absolutely critical point that researchers stress. This finding is not interpreted as some kind of individual deficiency. They're not saying Black candidates are less skilled or make worse career choices. Not at all.
Right, that's crucial. So what do they argue it reflects?
They argue that the data reflects deeper structural realities. These average differences in work history structure, maybe slightly less narrow specialization,
Right.
or paths that look less directly relevant to one specific job description are likely manifestations of systemic factors.
You know, things like maybe unequal access to certain networks early on, or fewer mentorship opportunities in highly specialized fields, or maybe facing barriers that just lead to less linear, less stable career paths sometimes.
Exactly, those kinds of things. Structural forces that shape the opportunities people have access to over time. And these opportunities, or lack thereof, influence the shape of their work history as it appears on a resume. So the bias, according to this research, isn't necessarily happening primarily when a human hiring manager consciously looks at a Black applicant's resume and thinks, I won't hire this person because of their race. Though that can happen too, of course.
Right.
But this study points to a bias that's already present, you could say, baked into the data of the work history itself. If, and this is a big if the hiring system or the algorithm is designed to strongly privilege only very narrow relevance and very high specialization above everything else.
Wow. Okay, let me see if I get this. The system is evaluating criteria like narrow relevance or specialization. But those criteria themselves might be outcomes of unequal structures or opportunities experienced by different groups. That really shifts where you look for the source of the bias, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It moves the focus, or at least broadens it. It moves beyond just looking for individual bias or discriminatory intent during the resume review phase to examining the structural forces that shape the input data, the work histories themselves, and also the design of the hiring process that evaluates that data. What criteria does it prioritize?
Okay, so given that finding, what are the big takeaways? What should employers, companies be thinking about based on this?
Well, the researchers point to two main implications, really. First, Companies need to question the often unstated, maybe unconscious assumption that the most narrowly specialized or the most directly relevant candidate is automatically the best fit for every single role.
Because sticking rigidly to only that perfect narrow match could disproportionately screen out people from groups whose work histories might look broader, perhaps due to those structural reasons we talked about.
Precisely. Professor Leung is quoted saying something like, "You could argue there are many situations where someone with a broader range of experiences might actually be a better hire." Adaptable maybe brings different perspectives. He suggests that consciously loosening that strict requirement for hyper-specific relevance, maybe looking more holistically at skills and potential, could be one way to mitigate this specific type of bias.
Okay, so reevaluating what qualified really means. Looking beyond just a perfect keyword match based on past job descriptions. That makes sense. What's the second major implication?
The second one really challenges that widespread belief, or maybe hope, that just adopting data-driven hiring tools or algorithms automatically makes the process neutral and objective, removes human bias.
Right, because the data itself, the work history data in this case, carries the imprint of existing structural inequality.
Exactly. If you build an algorithm, or even just a standardized screening process, that heavily weights metrics like work history relevance or specialization, and you don't account for the fact that those metrics themselves are influenced by systemic racial inequalities, well, then your supposedly objective system is likely just going to replicate and perpetuate those very same inequalities.
So the algorithm isn't necessarily biased in its code, maybe,
Right.
but it's operating on biased data or optimizing for biased criteria without understanding the context.
That's a great way to put it. The legacy of inequality gets embedded in the metrics, which then feed the system. It really highlights how important it is to understand the social context that shapes the data you're using in hiring, and to be critical of seemingly neutral evaluation criteria.
Okay, so let's try to bring this deep dive together then. This research uses some really innovative methods like that word to vec thing to show something quite profound. It shows that what seems like a purely objective measure of a candidate, things like how relevant or specialized their work history is, might not be neutral at all. It can reflect structural inequalities that are way outside any single individual's control.
And relying solely on those metrics in hiring, even if you're using data and algorithms with the best intentions, can unintentionally end up perpetuating racial bias.
It really forces us to confront this idea that meritocracy,
Yeah.
it isn't just about evaluating individuals based on their past achievements on paper. It also has to involve examining how systemic factors might have influenced those very pasts, those opportunities, those work histories.
Absolutely. It adds a crucial layer to the conversation.
So this deep dive really reveals how these broader structural forces can shape the very foundation of a job application, your work history, and how systems built to evaluate those histories can introduce bias, maybe inadvertently, often before anyone even considers your name or your potential. So whether you're someone out there applying for jobs right now, or maybe you're involved in making hiring decisions, designing processes, reviewing applications, how did this research change the way you think about what qualified genuinely means?
Yeah, that's the key question, and maybe here's a final thought to mull over as you go forward. If something that seems as concrete and objective as a work history on a resume can carry these hidden structural biases,
Yeah.
what other criteria that we commonly use in selection processes, maybe not just in hiring, but think about college admissions or loan applications or other areas where people are selected or rejected, might also be influenced by factors that have little or nothing to do with an individual's actual capability, their potential, or their inherent merit?